we
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, the only show where Shaka answers your questions about politics in Africa. I am Peter Clotte, sitting in for Paul Indio, and with me is the great and indefatigable Shaka Sali. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Peter.
How are you?
I remain simple, easy, and as some of my fans have suggested, an awesome son of Africa.
You are watching Shaka Extra Time, a show where we answer your questions and talks about politics in Africa. Now, let's go to some questions from our Facebook followers. Paul Songa Msaki asks, asking from the nullified elections in Malawi, what do you make of what was done in terms of the judgment from the Constitutional Court that ordered an election rerun in 150 days, basically nullifying last year's general election, particularly with the presidential vote?
It is very interesting, Peter. You know, you and I have talked a lot about that. And as a matter of fact, I'm very delighted to say that you and I, in a sense, actually did call it. For some reason, we did have confidence in the ability of the Malawian judicial system to do its work. And also especially given that the president of Malawi himself, not only is he a lawyer, he is a former law professor. He is a man who should know better in terms of living in a society of laws, not a society of men or women. But you know, it is very interesting because this, I think, if I'm correct, is perhaps the second time in Africa that such a thing has occurred. It first occurred in the Republic of Kenya. And it is also interesting that both Kenya and Malawi had the founding presidents who spent many, many years in Europe, and in the particular case of the Malawian president, Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda, in America. More years in America he spent than those he spent in the United Kingdom. And for Kenya, you are talking about Jomo Kenyatta, who was there for a very long time. And these two individuals were also some of the founders of Pan-Africanism as we know it today. They attended a major Pan-African conference, which had been chaired, I think, by the late W.E.B. Du Bois.
Right.
Dr. Du Bois, who happens to be buried in your homeland,
Right.
in Accra, the Ghanaian capital. They were people who, I think, learned from the experiences they acquired by staying in these democratic societies, at least domestically, in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America. And so one could probably be tempted to say that what we are looking at is something akin to their legacy. Because these are the only two countries on the African continent that have allowed the judiciary system to be independent to such an extent that it has the confidence to call it like it says it.
Do you foresee the ruling DPP party, the Democratic People's Party, to appeal to the Supreme Court about the judgment passed? And is it a true reflection of the independence of the judiciary in Malawi when the judges, the 5 panel judges overseeing this ruling, complained to the Chief Justice that there have been several attempts to bribe them?
Yes, but let's face it, I think this constitutional court made a decision that was unanimous.
Right.
In a culture of laws like that, even if they appeal to the Supreme Court, it may be very difficult for the Supreme Court to reverse this. And especially, you have seen how the people of Malawi have reacted on the ground. You know, laws are not made in a vacuum. Laws are made, in a sense, to reflect sometimes also to the sense, really, and the mood of society and all that kind of stuff. And it seems to me, when you look at some of the evidence that was presented, I think that it reaches a very, very high threshold. We're talking about incontrovertible evidence, not liable to falter. And so I think that it will hold, and I think that we are going to see a rerun. Now, the question is whether or not that rerun is going to meet the democratic standards of being credible, transparent, free and fair. It remains to be seen, because we saw what happened in Kenya. What happened in Kenya the second time really was kind of like a travesty, to the extent that the ODM and former Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Odinga ended up, in fact, boycotting the process. They did not participate in the election that was, of course, overwhelmingly won by then incumbent president and still incumbent president Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta. I think that the system in Malawi should at least conduct an election that reflects some of the things that were pointed out by the Constitutional Court. Because at the end of the day, who is the winner?
Right.
It is the people of Malawi and the people of Africa. It's not these different political parties and what have you. And really, Africa needs to get on track. Africa is not going to develop until and unless it begins practicing social, economic, political justice for all its daughters and sons.
What do you make of the constitutional provision that allows the current president, incumbent president, to choose the new chairperson of the Malawi Electoral Commission? Of course, Dr. Justice Jane Ansah, the chairperson, had indicated that depending on the verdict, she was going to retire.
Yes.
So if she follows through and retires, then the onus lies on the president to name another person to chair. After the HRDC, a political pressure group, has demanded her resignation and accused her of bungling the election. So what do you see as next, particularly when Dr. Saulos Chilima, the embattled former vice president, has been returned to work with President Mutharika?
You talk about former vice president. In fact, he was former vice president until the day the verdict came out.
Right.
I am told that the police officers went to him and saluted, and he was wondering why they had come, because he didn't think he had committed any crime.
Right.
They said, "No, sir, we have come to escort you to your former offices as the new vice president of the Republic of Malawi." It will be very interesting to see how it functions, because obviously you only have 150 days in which you have an election conducted. I hope that, again, this election, frankly, that is going to be a rerun, I hope that it is going to meet acceptable national and international democratic standards.
I was speaking with Dr. Chidante, who is a member, a prominent member of the United Transformation Movement, the party that Dr. Chilima formed after resigning from the DPP, the ruling party in
Right.
Malawi. And he was telling me that the vice president is going to speak to the nation at a press conference at the UTM headquarters in Lilongwe tomorrow. So it remains to be seen what we are going to hear from him. Although the UTM has been calling for calm, for people not to create any tension or fight with supporters of the DPP and other political parties. Well, what is your take on what he might say tomorrow?
I think whatever he says really will probably not make much difference, because the people of Malawi are very peaceful people. They are very peaceful, very laid back, very, very pleasant, very law-abiding type of citizens and all that kind of stuff. They are not very, very radical. I think that they will follow whatever they are instructed to follow. At the end of the day, hope that they do have this time around an election, and an election whose results will be reflecting the will of the people, not the will of the announcer of the results,
Right.
or the will of the individuals who count the votes.
Right. So let's go to Kenya. You mentioned Kenya and the similarities between Kenya and Malawi in terms of annulling the election. We heard the sad news about Mzee Daniel Arap Moi, a man who led Kenya for a long time as its leader, a man you've interacted with and spoke with and interviewed. When you heard about this news, what was your reaction?
As a human being, of course, I was saddened by his death. But then again, when you look at his age, he was 95. I think that people, at least supporters of him, should probably celebrate his contributions, or what they perceive as his contributions, as opposed to mourning him. He had a lot of good things that he did. And of course, he also, as a human being, he was not perfect.
Right.
He was not an angel. He also did some not so good things. But one thing I can tell you, having attempted to access former Kenyan President Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi for like 7 years before I could, in fact, get an opportunity to interview him. I found him a very interesting man in the sense that he was actually one of the few African rulers and leaders who was able to answer one of my questions. There are times when I have a question towards the end of my interviews, when I ask, when I have the opportunity to interview some of these people who are in hold important positions that give them an opportunity to make decisions that affect millions of people. I sometimes ask them to tell me, for example, what they consider to be the single most important decision that you have accomplished during, for example, your tenure in office. And also ask you the single most regrettable decision during that same period. I have to say he was one of the few people that was able to answer those two questions. No, sincerely.
So how was he like when you interacted with him on a number of occasions? How was he like on a personal level?
Very interesting, very thoughtful. He was a product, obviously, of British colonialism. He was a very hardworking man. But he also politically found himself as a product of the kind of phenomenon that obtained in Africa at the time, what you would call the one-party state syndrome.
Right.
And therefore, you had these people who are in leadership positions, essentially dominating the entire political space, almost never, perhaps, listening really to another point of view. And for that, there are times when he had some kind of autocratic tendencies. But when it came to education, for example, I remember in one of my interviews, he told me that his single most important decision, he responded by talking about how he was an education president. And I asked him how. He talked about how he had built a lot of schools in Kenya, provided, for example, milk to young people and what have you to go to school, which I found, by the way, a lot of people, in fact, agreeing with him. And I also had an opportunity, after he left office, to visit him in Kabarak, near Nakuru, where he built a small university where I went and talked to the students of Kabarak University. It had a British vice-chancellor. And he also had a high school, a Kabarak high school there. And he also had, by the way, a very good school called Sacho High School. Sacho, he is, in fact, one of his alma maters. He was born near Sacho there. And I went there and spoke with some of the students by the swimming pool in one of the remotest parts, really, of Kenya. And frankly, from my assessment, some of those kids, each of them could probably have found their way to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Right.
The emphasis was on science and religion. And he definitely built schools. A lot of people would agree. But they also criticized him for the manner in which he did not seem to allow adequate freedom of expression, did not allow what you would call adequate freedom of press, just like it happened at the time on the African continent. As a matter of fact, we are talking about the 1990s here. But even today, Peter, you are a journalist, and you are definitely one of the best I know that I have interacted with. You still have a lot of problems with African rurals.
That's true.
And this is 2020.
And 20.
I still have a lot of presidents that I invite on my show, and for some reason they don't want to come to the show to be able to tell us how they go about the business of running their countries. And so this man, one thing I found that despite the fact that he didn't go to school very much, he was a very smart guy. I remember I had a roommate, a Kenyan roommate, when I was in graduate school at the University of California, Los Angeles, the 1980s. I'm not going to mention his name, but I remember him telling me about his president then, Daniel Arap Moi. And he talked about how the man was not a particularly smart man. He had problems even speaking his own Kalenjin language. He had problems speaking Kiswahili. And he had obviously a problem speaking the English language. And he talked about, in terms of ideas, he was short at the gray matter. I cannot believe by the first time I actually had an opportunity to interview President Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. I remember asking him the first question. This was, by the way, at the time when the Tanzanian founding president, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, had died. And in fact, we met with Moi in Dar es Salaam. The interview was actually made possible by the fact that I received what I call, quote unquote, foreign aid.
Right.
From, at that time, a Tanzanian foreign minister called Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete, who subsequently, of course, became president of the United Republic of Tanzania for 10 years.
Right.
He introduced me to the president of Kenya, and we just talked, and I asked him, I told him how I had been frustrated for the 7 years before I could actually reach him, because I wanted really to interview him. And he asked me if I could go to Nairobi, the Kenyan capital, because we're in Dar es Salaam right now. And I said, yes, I could. He happened also to be a friend of one S.K. Macharia. Macharia was our affiliate in Kenya and was the owner and the proprietor of Royal Media, which among other things ran Citizen Television. So as a matter of fact, I eventually ended up interviewing President Moi with the crew of Citizen Television. This was at a time when I had also just come from Kinshasa, the DRC capital, having had a very rare opportunity to interview another very difficult leader to access at the time, Laurent Desire Kabila. I had had an interview with him in Lubumbashi. And I was able to sit down with President Moi. And we started talking. And my first question was essentially to tell me his reaction and reflection on the passing away of his colleague, really, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And I remember him saying how he respected the Mwalimu, Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And he talked about, especially because the man was a leader, true leader, an African, who had in fact even suggested before independence in 1961 to delay, suggested the British to delay the independence of Tanganyika so that Kenya and Uganda together would be free and join Tanganyika to form the East African Federation. And he was so articulate, I couldn't believe it.
You are watching Shaka Extra Time, a show where we answer your questions and talk about politics in Africa. Now let's go to some questions from our Facebook followers. Revocatus Tesha asks, why are the standards of politics measured on a Western scale? Is there nothing good about democracy that Africa that can be referenced and learned by the rest of the world?
You know, Peter, I sometimes really wonder whether some of these individuals who are talking about democracy, whether in fact they have taken trouble in understanding what a democracy actually means. Democracy is a value-free concept. It is a universal concept. Democracy, essentially, you are talking about aspects like justice.
Right.
Justice is not necessarily limited to the Western world, to Europe, to America. Justice, from time immemorial, was even practiced in Africa. Fairness.
Right.
Fairness is a universal value. Accountability.
Right.
Accountability is a universal value.
Right.
So maybe we should not talk about the word democracy, because in fact the type of democracy that we use was, in a sense, begun by the Greeks. Maybe we should talk about social, economic, political, cultural, justice for all. Maybe we should talk about the benefits of, in fact, what democracy represents. Then that way, some of these individuals may not ask some of these questions really. Because at the end of the day, we are talking about a society that does not belong to an individual or a couple of individuals and whatever you, but actually belongs to all the people. We're talking about creating societies of laws.
Right.
We're talking about societies that do not really, they are not societies of men or women. We're talking about societies that can deliver benefits to their people. We're talking about societies where individuals should feel that they have a right to own an opinion that may not necessarily be on the same page with the ruling party or the government of the day. Because when people are free, when people can talk, when people can make contributions, the society or the country is better off. we're talking about part of the problem that Africa really suffers from, is having individuals at the top of the political harem who are called leaders, but in fact are not leaders. By their deeds, in fact, they are rulers. If they were leaders, first of all, they would not make any important decisions without consulting their own people.
Right.
They would not be very far away in terms of their operations from their own people. They would not be in a situation where, for example, they do not allow or prevent the freedom of the press, of the media. They would not be in a situation where they would be practicing nepotism.
Well, Shaka, tomorrow you're hosting your show, 20 years in the game. What are you talking about tomorrow, and what should the people expect?
Tomorrow, Peter, we are talking about a report by Human Rights Watch,
right,
an international human rights institution which you know very well, which is headquartered in New York.
Right.
And the headquarters, in fact, is in a building. When I was in primary school, it was the tallest building in the world, the Empire State Plaza.
Right.
So they came up with a report, and they are very critical of the state of human rights in the Great Lakes region.
Right.
We're talking about Uganda. We're talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're talking about the Republic of Rwanda. We're talking about Burundi, and those areas around there especially. And so we will be having a conversation on what is happening and what needs to be done in order to address those problems. You know, we need leaders, sincerely, who reflect what I call the 4 C's: conscience, character, courage,
right,
and country. Just like a British missionary Scottish explorer, David Livingstone, he introduced the 3 C's that in fact persuaded the British to embark on the experiment of colonialism.
right.
It was Christianity, civilization, and commerce. And so, my friend, for a leader to do good to his people or her people, they need to reflect the 4 C's: conscience, character, courage, and country.
So far, looking on the African plane, within a minute, our time is running out, do you see any of the leaders exhibiting some of these traits that you talked about?
There are some, but not very many. There are very, very few really that do.
Should Africans be hopeful of seeing some of these leaders exhibiting some of these traits?
Africans can only be hopeful if they themselves can assert their rights. You know, as long as you do not have a society that is socially and politically conscious or aware, so that it knows that it is the primary stakeholder and it is the one that is in charge of society, employs a person called a president,
right,
employs a person called the chief justice, employs a person who is an ambassador, who are all these senior government ministers and what have you, permanent secretaries.
right.
As long as the attitude does not change, there is not going to be any development.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us for Shaka Extra Time, a show where we answer your questions about politics in Africa. I'm Peter Clotty, sitting in for Paul Indio. See you all next week, and have a great evening.